The autumn leaves crunched beneath small feet as 8-year-old Emma Richardson walked the familiar path to Millbrook Elementary School. It was October 15, 2003, and the morning air carried that particular crispness that promised winter wasn't far behind. The small town of Cedar Falls, Michigan, was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, and where the most exciting news usually involved the high school football team's latest victory. Emma had walked this route hundreds of times before, 3 blocks down Maple Street, past the old Thompson house with its peeling blue paint and overgrown garden, left on Oak Avenue where Mrs. Henderson always waved from her kitchen window, and straight to the red brick building where she was in 3rd grade. Her mother, Sarah Richardson, had kissed her goodbye at exactly 7:42 a.m., the same time she did every morning. Sarah worked the early shift at the local diner and trusted that Emma, responsible beyond her years, would make it to school safely as she always did. The walk should have taken 12 minutes. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Collins, marked her absent when the bell rang at 8:15 a.m. By 8:30, the school had called Sarah at work. By 9, every police officer in Cedar Falls was searching the streets. By noon, the story had spread through town like wildfire, and volunteers were organizing search parties. Emma Richardson had simply vanished between her front door and the school entrance, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. Detective Michael Torres, a 20-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, had seen missing children cases before, but something about Emma's disappearance unsettled him from the very beginning. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no abandoned backpack or scattered belongings. Her pink and purple backpack, filled with carefully organized homework and her favorite gel pens, was never found. Neither were her light-up sneakers that blinked red when she walked, the ones she had begged her mother to buy for her birthday just 2 months earlier. The investigation consumed the small town. Search dogs tracked Emma's scent down Maple Street, past the Thompson house, but lost it completely at the intersection of Oak Avenue. It was as if she had simply stopped existing at that precise spot. The FBI was called in after 48 hours, bringing with them sophisticated equipment and years of experience, but even they found nothing concrete. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, no surveillance footage from the handful of security cameras in the area. Sarah Richardson aged years in those first few weeks. The vibrant 32-year-old single mother who had always worn her heart on her sleeve became a hollow version of herself. She quit her job at the diner to dedicate every waking moment to finding her daughter. She plastered Emma's school photograph on every telephone pole, store window, and bulletin board within a 100-mile radius. The image became burned into the collective memory of Cedar Falls. A gap-toothed smile, bright brown eyes, and 2 pigtails tied with yellow ribbons. The media attention was overwhelming at first. News vans lined the quiet streets, reporters knocked on doors at all hours, and Emma's story was featured on national television programs. Sarah appeared on every show that would have her, clutching Emma's favorite stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, and pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. The town rallied around her, organizing fundraisers, distributing flyers, and maintaining a constant vigil of hope. But as the weeks turned into months, the media attention began to fade. The reporters moved on to other stories, the news vans disappeared, and the volunteers slowly returned to their normal lives. The FBI scaled back their involvement, leaving the case in the hands of local law enforcement. Detective Torres continued to work the case, but with no new leads and no fresh evidence, the investigation began to feel like chasing shadows. The theories were endless and heartbreaking. Some believed Emma had been abducted by a stranger, possibly someone passing through town who had spotted her walking alone. Others suggested she might have been taken by someone she knew, someone who had been watching her routine and waiting for the right moment. There were reports of suspicious vehicles in the area, strange phone calls, and men who didn't belong in the neighborhood, but none of these leads panned out. Sarah's sister, Lisa, moved to Cedar Falls to help with the search and to provide emotional support. She watched her sister transform from a hopeful mother into a woman haunted by possibilities. Sarah would drive the streets for hours, searching every alley, every abandoned building, every patch of woods where a child might be hidden. She kept Emma's room exactly as it was, her bed made with the butterfly comforter Emma had picked out herself, her stuffed animals arranged just so, waiting for her return. The first anniversary of Emma's disappearance was marked by a candlelight vigil in the town square. Nearly 500 people gathered, holding flickering flames against the October darkness, sharing memories of the little girl who had touched so many lives in her short 8 years. Sarah spoke briefly, her voice barely above a whisper, thanking everyone for not forgetting Emma, and begging them to keep looking, keep hoping, keep believing that somewhere, somehow, her daughter would come home. As the crowd dispersed that night, Detective Torres stood alone under the streetlight, watching Sarah walk away with her head bowed and her shoulders shaking. He had promised her he would never give up, that Emma's case would remain open until they found answers. But in his heart, he feared that October evening in 2003 might be the last time the whole town would gather to remember Emma Richardson. Time, he knew, had a way of softening even the sharpest grief, and missing children cases that went unsolved for more than a year rarely found resolution. The second year brought fewer vigils, fewer search parties, and fewer conversations about Emma. Life in Cedar Falls slowly returned to its normal rhythm, though the missing child posters remained posted around town, now faded and weathered, but still bearing that gap-toothed smile. Sarah continued her solitary searches, but they became less frequent, less desperate. The hope that had sustained her through the first year was beginning to crack under the weight of silence. If stories like this move you, you might want to subscribe to hear how this mystery unfolds. By the third year, Emma's case had become what law enforcement calls a cold case. The active investigation had been scaled back, though Detective Torres still followed up on any tips that came in. The file remained on his desk, thick with reports, interviews, and photographs, but the leads had dried up. Sarah had started working again, taking a part-time job at the local library, finding solace in the quiet order of books and the kindness of patrons who remembered Emma but didn't ask painful questions. The town had learned to live with the mystery, the way communities do when tragedy becomes part of their history. Emma's disappearance had changed Cedar Falls in subtle but permanent ways. Parents walked their children to school more often, neighbors paid closer attention to strangers, and there was an underlying awareness that safety was not guaranteed, even in the most peaceful places. But Emma's story wasn't over. Somewhere in the forests and fields surrounding Cedar Falls, time was preserving secrets that would eventually surface. The October morning that had begun, like any other, had set events in motion that would take more than a decade to fully understand. And in 2015, on a cold February day when the snow lay thick on the ground and the town had almost forgotten what it felt like to hope, a stray dog would wander into the police station and change everything. 12 years have a way of reshaping a town's memory, softening the sharp edges of tragedy until they become part of the landscape. By 2015, Cedar Falls had grown beyond its original borders, with new subdivisions sprouting on what used to be farmland and a shopping center where the old Miller farm once stood. The elementary school had been renovated, its red brick facade now covered with modern siding, and Mrs. Collins had long since retired, taking with her the vivid memory of that October morning when Emma Richardson's desk remained empty. Sarah Richardson, now 44, had learned to navigate the peculiar geography of a mother's grief. She had moved from the house on Maple Street 5 years earlier, unable to bear the daily reminder of Emma's last walk to school. Her new apartment on the other side of town was small and practical, decorated with photographs of Emma at various ages and the artwork she had created in second grade, now framed and hanging in the hallway like a museum to a life interrupted. The years had been kinder to Sarah than the first raw months of loss, but they had also been relentless in their accumulation of small surrenders. She had stopped driving the streets looking for Emma, stopped checking every crowd for a glimpse of what her daughter might look like as a teenager. She had learned to smile at work, to participate in conversations about normal things, to function in a world that had moved on from her tragedy. But she had never stopped listening for the phone to ring, never stopped hoping that someone, somewhere, might have information about Emma. Detective Torres, now nearing retirement, had kept Emma's case file on his desk for 12 years. It had become a fixture in the police station, a thick manila folder that newer officers would glance at curiously before being told the story by their more experienced colleagues. The case had defined much of Torres's career, representing both his greatest failure and his most enduring commitment. He had followed hundreds of leads, interviewed countless suspects, and traveled to distant states chasing tips that ultimately led nowhere. The town itself bore subtle scars from Emma's disappearance. The path she had walked to school had been renamed Emma's Way in a small ceremony on the 10th anniversary of her disappearance. A bench had been placed at the intersection of Maple Street and Oak Avenue, the last place her scent had been detected by the search dogs. The bench bore a small plaque, "In memory of Emma Richardson, forever in our hearts." People rarely sat on it, but they noticed it, and in noticing they remembered. Lisa, Sarah's sister, had stayed in Cedar Falls longer than anyone expected. What had begun as a temporary move to support her sister had evolved into a permanent relocation. She had found work at the local bank, married a man who understood the shadow that Emma's disappearance cast over their family, and had 2 children of her own. But she had never stopped watching Sarah carefully, never stopped worrying about the moments when the grief would surface unexpectedly, triggered by a child's laugh or a school bus passing by. The media had moved on completely by 2015. Emma's story was no longer news, no longer compelling enough to warrant television coverage or newspaper articles. The anniversary of her disappearance was marked only by a small gathering of family and a few longtime friends, usually held at the cemetery where Sarah had placed a memorial stone despite having no body to bury. The stone read simply, "Emma Richardson, beloved daughter, 1995 to 2003, waiting for her journey home." In those 12 years, other children had gone missing from neighboring towns, and some of those cases had been solved, bringing both closure and renewed pain to Sarah. Each resolution of another family's tragedy was a reminder that Emma's story remained unfinished, her fate unknown. Sarah had attended support groups for parents of missing children, finding comfort in shared understanding, but also confronting the reality that some mysteries were never solved. The search dogs that had tracked Emma's scent had long since died, their handlers retired or moved on to other cases. The FBI agents who had worked the investigation had been reassigned to different offices, different crimes, different unsolved puzzles. The volunteers who had organized search parties had scattered to other concerns, other causes, other urgent needs. The machinery of investigation had gradually wound down, leaving behind only the stubborn persistence of a small-town detective and the unending vigil of a mother's love. But the forest surrounding Cedar Falls had kept its secrets undisturbed. The oak trees that had been saplings when Emma disappeared were now mature, their branches reaching toward the sky like arms stretched in supplication. The undergrowth had thickened, creating natural barriers that discouraged casual exploration. The old logging roads had become overgrown, passable only by those who knew the terrain intimately, or by creatures that moved through the woods without regard for human paths. It was in this forgotten landscape that time had been at work, patiently revealing what had been hidden. The harsh winters and humid summers of Michigan had their own way of uncovering truth, of bringing to the surface what had been buried or abandoned. The cycles of freezing and thawing, of growth and decay, had been slowly preparing for a revelation that would come not through human investigation, but through the persistence of nature itself. And in the animal shelter on the outskirts of town, a stray dog had been waiting for 3 months, unclaimed and unnamed, exhibiting behaviors that puzzled the staff. The dog, a mixed breed with intelligent eyes and a nervous disposition, had been found wandering the streets during a particularly cold spell in November 2014. Unlike other strays, this dog seemed to have a purpose, a destination it was trying to reach. It would pace the kennel, whining softly, and showed unusual agitation whenever it heard sirens or saw police cars. The shelter workers had named the dog Ranger because of his tendency to patrol the perimeter of the fenced area. as if he were guarding something or searching for something they couldn't see. He was friendly with humans, but exhibited a restlessness that suggested he had work to do, places to be, secrets to share. The veterinarian who examined him estimated he was about 4 or 5 years old, well-fed and clearly cared for at some point, but he had no identification tags, no microchip, no way to trace his origins. As February of 2015 settled over Cedar Falls with its bitter cold and heavy snow, the town went about its business with the resigned efficiency of a place that had learned to live with unanswered questions. The children who had been Emma's classmates were now in college, pursuing futures that Emma would never have the chance to explore. The teachers who had known her had moved on to other students, other successes, other heartbreaks. The world had continued turning as it always does, carrying the living forward while the missing remained frozen in time. But in the mathematics of fate, in the precise calculations of timing and circumstance, all the elements were finally aligning for a revelation that would shake Cedar Falls to its foundations. A stray dog with a mysterious past, a detective nearing retirement, a mother who had never stopped hoping, and a forest that had been keeping secrets for more than a decade were about to converge in a way that would prove that some stories don't end when we stop looking for their conclusions. The morning of February 18, 2015, dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that makes snow-covered landscapes look like scenes from a fairy tale. It was the kind of morning that made people appreciate the beauty of winter, even as they hurried through it toward the warmth of their destinations. It was also the morning when Ranger, the stray dog who had been waiting at the shelter for 3 months, would finally lead someone to understand what he had been trying to communicate all along. The Cedar Falls Police Department had seen quieter mornings than February 18, 2015, but it had certainly seen busier ones. Detective Torres sat at his desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, reviewing a case file that had nothing to do with Emma Richardson. After 12 years, he had learned to focus on the cases he could solve, the mysteries that yielded to investigation and persistence. The Emma Richardson file remained in its familiar place, but Torres had trained himself not to look at it first thing every morning, a habit that had consumed too many years of his career. Officer Janet Martinez was manning the front desk when the automatic doors slid open with their familiar whoosh, bringing with them a gust of frigid air and an unexpected visitor. The dog that trotted into the police station moved with purpose, his breath forming small clouds in the sudden warmth. He was medium-sized, with the kind of mixed breeding that suggested intelligence and adaptability, his coat a blend of brown and black that hadn't been groomed in months, but wasn't matted or neglected. "Well, hello there," Martinez said, looking up from her paperwork. The dog approached the desk with his tail wagging but his eyes alert, as if he understood exactly where he was and why he had come. "You're not supposed to be in here, buddy." The dog sat down directly in front of the desk and looked at Martinez with an expression that seemed almost human in its intensity. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear, then let out a soft whine that somehow conveyed urgency without alarm. Martinez had been working dispatch and front desk duties for 8 years, and she had never seen a stray dog behave with such focused intentionality. "Torres," she called over her shoulder, "you might want to see this." Detective Torres looked up from his paperwork, annoyed at the interruption, but curious about the unusual tone in Martinez's voice. He had worked with her long enough to know that she wasn't easily rattled or impressed. When he saw the dog sitting patiently at the front desk, his first instinct was to assume it was someone's pet that had wandered away from home. "Animal control issue?" he asked, approaching the desk. "I don't think so," Martinez replied. "This guy walked in here like he had an appointment. Look at him." Torres studied the dog more carefully. The animal's behavior was indeed unusual. He showed no signs of fear or confusion, no indication that he was lost or disoriented. Instead, he seemed to be waiting for something, his attention focused on the 2 officers with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "He's probably just cold," Torres said. But even as he spoke, he realized that didn't explain the dog's behavior. The animal wasn't seeking shelter or warmth. He was seeking something else entirely. The dog stood up suddenly and walked over to Torres, sniffing his hands, and then looking up at him with those intelligent eyes. Then he did something that made both officers pause. He walked over to the bulletin board near the front desk, the one that held various community notices and safety information, and sat down beneath it. He looked up at the board, then back at Torres, then up at the board again. "That's weird," Martinez said. "It's like he's trying to tell us something." Torres followed the dog's gaze to the bulletin board. Among the various notices and flyers, there was one item that had been there so long it had become part of the fixture, a missing child poster for Emma Richardson. The photo had faded over the years, but Emma's gap-toothed smile was still visible, her pigtails still tied with yellow ribbons. The poster had been moved and updated several times, but it had never been removed. The dog whined again, more insistently this time, and pawed at the base of the bulletin board. Torres felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. In his 20-plus years of police work, he had learned to pay attention to instincts, to the small details that seemed insignificant until they revealed themselves to be crucial. The dog's behavior was triggering something in his investigative mind, a sense that this was more than a random occurrence. "Martinez, call the animal shelter," Torres said. "See if they're missing anyone." While Martinez made the call, Torres knelt down to the dog's level. The animal allowed him to check for identification tags or any other markers that might indicate ownership. There were none, but Torres noticed something else. The dog's paws were dirty with a specific type of soil, dark and rich, the kind that was common in the heavily forested areas around Cedar Falls, but not typical of the town's streets or residential areas. "Shelter says they've been housing a stray for 3 months, Martinez reported. "Mixed breed, about 4 or 5 years old, answers to Ranger. They've been trying to find him a home, but he keeps showing signs of distress, like he's looking for something." Torres looked at the dog, Ranger, with new interest. 3 months, he said quietly. That would put his arrival right around the time of the first heavy snow in November. Ranger seemed to recognize his name when Martinez said it, his tail wagging slightly. But his attention remained focused on the bulletin board and the faded poster of Emma Richardson. He whined again, more softly this time, and began to move toward the front door of the station. "He wants to go somewhere," Martinez observed. Torres made a decision that would have seemed irrational to anyone who didn't understand the peculiar logic of cold cases and the way small clues could suddenly illuminate long, dark corners of a mystery. "I'm going to follow him," he said. "Follow him where?" "Wherever he wants to go." Martinez looked at Torres as if he had lost his mind, but she had worked with him long enough to know that his instincts were usually sound, even when they seemed unusual. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No, stay here and man the desk. If I'm not back in 2 hours, send someone looking for me." Torres retrieved his winter coat and radio from his desk, then returned to find Ranger waiting by the front door, his body language suggesting both patience and urgency. The dog seemed to understand that Torres was going to follow him, and his tail wagged with what appeared to be relief. "This is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the stupidest," Torres muttered as he opened the door. The cold air hit them both immediately, but Ranger seemed energized by it. He trotted ahead of Torres, pausing occasionally to make sure the detective was following, but moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. They walked through the downtown area, past the shops and restaurants that made up the heart of Cedar Falls, and toward the residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. Torres radioed his location to dispatch as they walked, documenting their route in case someone needed to find them later. The dog led him through areas of town that Torres knew well, but toward destinations he wouldn't have expected. They passed the elementary school where Emma had been a student, past the intersection where her scent had been lost 12 years earlier, and continued toward the older part of town where the houses sat on larger lots and the forest began to encroach on civilization. The snow crunched under their feet as they walked, and Torres found himself thinking about the Emma Richardson case in ways he hadn't for years. The dog's behavior was too specific, too purposeful to be coincidental. Something about this animal, about his timing and his apparent connection to Emma's poster, suggested that the case might not be as cold as everyone had assumed. After 20 minutes of walking, Ranger led Torres to the edge of town, where the paved roads gave way to gravel and the houses became sparse. The forest loomed ahead of them, dark and dense, its trees heavy with snow. Ranger paused at the tree line, looking back at Torres as if to make sure he was still following, then disappeared into the woods. Torres hesitated for a moment, knowing that following a stray dog into the forest in the middle of winter was not standard police procedure. But something about the animal's behavior, about the way he had appeared at the police station and focused on Emma's poster, convinced him that this was more than a wild goose chase. He adjusted his radio, checked his flashlight, and followed Ranger into the trees. The forest in February was a study in contrasts, the stark black of bare branches against the pristine white of snow, the silence broken only by the crunch of footsteps and the distant sound of wind through the trees. Detective Torres had hunted these woods as a younger man, had participated in search parties that had combed through these same trails looking for Emma Richardson 12 years earlier. But following the dog named Ranger, he felt as if he was seeing the landscape for the first time. Ranger moved through the forest with the confidence of long familiarity, choosing paths that weren't always obvious to Torres, but that seemed to lead somewhere specific. The dog would pause occasionally, sniffing the air or the ground, then continue with renewed purpose. Torres found himself wondering how long Ranger had been wandering these woods, how many times he had made this journey, and what had finally driven him to seek help at the police station. The snow was deeper here, undisturbed by foot traffic or vehicle exhaust, and Torres could feel the cold seeping through his winter boots. His radio crackled occasionally with routine police business from town, but the sound seemed to come from another world, distant and irrelevant to the strange mission he found himself on. He checked his watch. They had been walking for 30 minutes, moving steadily deeper into the forest. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Torres asked, and Ranger turned to look at him as if he understood the question. The dog's expression was serious, almost somber, and he seemed to be carrying a weight that Torres was only beginning to comprehend. They followed what appeared to be an old logging road, now overgrown and barely visible beneath the snow. Torres remembered this area from the original search for Emma, but the teams had covered so much ground that it was difficult to recall specific details. The forest seemed different in winter, more closed in and mysterious, the kind of place where secrets could remain hidden for years. Ranger suddenly stopped and began to whine, a sound that was different from his earlier vocalizations. This was a sound of distress, of recognition, of something that caused him pain. He was standing next to a large oak tree, its trunk scarred by years of weather, and marked with the initials that teenagers had carved during summer adventures. The dog circled the tree several times, then sat down and looked at Torres with eyes that seemed to be pleading for understanding. Torres examined the tree carefully, looking for anything that might explain Ranger's behavior. The bark was rough and weathered, the carved initials old and grown over, but nothing seemed immediately significant. He was about to suggest they continue walking when Ranger stood up and walked about 20 feet away from the tree, toward a depression in the ground that was barely visible beneath the snow. The dog began to dig, his paws working frantically at the frozen earth and snow. Torres watched for a moment, then approached the spot where Ranger was digging. Even through the snow he could see that the ground here was different, softer, more recently disturbed, as if something had been buried and then partially uncovered by the natural processes of freezing and thawing. "Easy, boy," Torres said, kneeling down beside Ranger. "Let me take a look." Using his hands, Torres carefully brushed away the snow and loose earth that Ranger had displaced. What he found made his heart rate quicken, a piece of fabric, pink and purple, partially buried but still recognizable as synthetic material, the kind of material that might be used to make a child's backpack. Torres sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He had seen Emma Richardson's backpack in photographs hundreds of times. It was pink and purple, with cartoon characters, and a pattern that Sarah had described in detail during the initial investigation. The fabric he was looking at could be from that backpack, or it could be from any number of other items that had been discarded in the woods over the years, but Ranger's behavior suggested otherwise. The dog was watching Torres intently, his tail wagging slightly now, as if he had finally succeeded in communicating something important. Torres realized that he needed to approach this discovery with the same careful methodology he would use at any potential crime scene, even though he had no idea what he might find. He radioed dispatch to report his location and request backup, then began to carefully excavate the area around the fabric. Working slowly and methodically, he uncovered more pieces of the same material, arranged in a way that suggested they had once been part of a larger item. The fabric was weathered but not completely decomposed, preserved by the cold winters and protected by the layers of earth and snow. As he worked, Torres found himself thinking about the timeline. Emma had disappeared in October 2003, 12 years ago. If this fabric was from her backpack, it had been buried here for more than a decade, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves, snow, and accumulated debris. The fact that it was surfacing now in the exact spot where a stray dog had led him seemed like more than coincidence. Ranger had moved away from the excavation site and was now standing about 10 feet away, near a cluster of smaller trees. He was whining again, but this time the sound was different, more urgent, more insistent. Torres looked up from his work to see the dog pawing at the base of what appeared to be a very old pine tree, its trunk thick with age and its branches heavy with snow. "What is it now, boy?" Torres asked, but he was already moving toward the tree. The ground here was different as well, less disturbed than the spot where he had found the fabric, but marked with subtle signs that suggested human activity years earlier. There were depressions in the earth that might have been footprints, now filled with accumulated debris, and scratches on the tree bark that could have been made by tools or by desperate hands. Torres began to examine the area more carefully, using his flashlight to illuminate the base of the tree and the surrounding ground. What he found made him call for additional backup immediately. Carved into the bark of the pine tree, about 3 feet from the ground, were letters that spelled out a single word: help. The carving was old, weathered by years of exposure, but still clearly visible. The letters were uneven, as if they had been carved with a small knife or sharp object by someone who was either very young or working under difficult circumstances. Below the word help, there was something else, a small drawing of what appeared to be an elephant, crudely carved but recognizable. Torres felt his hands begin to shake as he stared at the carving. Emma Richardson's favorite stuffed animal had been an elephant named Mr. Peanuts. Her mother had mentioned it in dozens of interviews, had carried it with her to television appearances, had described it as Emma's constant companion. The elephant drawing carved into the tree bark was crude, but it was unmistakably meant to represent the same kind of stuffed animal. Ranger seemed to sense the significance of the discovery. He had stopped whining and was now sitting quietly beside Torres, his expression almost peaceful, as if a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The dog had led Torres to this spot for a reason, and that reason was becoming terrifyingly clear. Torres stepped back from the tree and surveyed the area with new eyes. They were in a natural clearing surrounded by dense forest, about a mile from the nearest road or house. It was the kind of place where someone could bring a child and be confident that their activities would not be observed or interrupted. The kind of place where a frightened 8-year-old might carve a desperate message into a tree, hoping that someone would eventually find it and understand. As Torres waited for backup to arrive, he found himself looking at Ranger with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. The dog had somehow known about this place, had been trying to lead someone here for months. How he had acquired this knowledge, how he had understood the significance of Emma's poster at the police station, remained a mystery. But his persistence had finally paid off, and Emma Richardson's story was about to take a turn that no one had expected. The sound of vehicles approaching through the forest broke the silence, and Torres could see the flash of emergency lights through the trees. The cavalry was arriving, and with them would come the forensic expertise needed to properly investigate what was shaping up to be the most significant development in the Emma Richardson case in 12 years. But as the search team prepared to expand their investigation, Torres couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to uncover the truth about what had happened to Emma Richardson on that October morning in 2003. The fabric, the carving, the location itself, These were clues that raised as many questions as they answered. And somewhere in the mathematics of tragedy and time, the complete story was still waiting to be discovered. The crime scene team arrived at the forest clearing within an hour, their equipment cases and cameras transforming the quiet woods into a hub of controlled activity. Detective Torres had cordoned off the area around both the fabric discovery and the carved tree using bright yellow tape that looked almost garish against the pristine snow. Ranger had been relocated to a patrol car, where he sat calmly in the back seat, watching the proceedings with the satisfied air of someone whose work was finally being taken seriously. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the forensic anthropologist who had been called in from the state crime lab, arrived just as the team was setting up their equipment. Torres had worked with her on several cases over the years, and he respected her methodical approach to evidence recovery. She surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading the stories that Earth and Time could tell. "Talk to me about the context," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling on latex gloves and adjusting her equipment. "How did you find this location?" Torres explained about Ranger's appearance at the police station, his behavior around Emma's poster, and the deliberate way he had led them to this spot. As he spoke, he realized how improbable the story sounded, but Dr. Vasquez listened without skepticism. She had learned long ago that truth often arrived through unexpected channels. "The fabric appears to be synthetic," she observed, examining the pieces Torres had carefully excavated. "Consistent with the description of the missing child's backpack. The coloration and pattern match the photographs in the file." She photographed each piece from multiple angles, then began the painstaking process of expanding the excavation. Working with brushes and small tools, she carefully removed layers of soil, documenting every step with photographs and detailed notes. The other members of the team spread out to examine the surrounding area, looking for additional evidence that might have been overlooked during the original search 12 years earlier. Officer Martinez arrived with Sarah Richardson, who had been contacted about the development in Emma's case. Torres had debated whether to call her, knowing that this discovery might raise false hopes or cause unnecessary pain, but he had ultimately decided that she had the right to know. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her sister Lisa beside her, both women silent as they watched the forensic team work. "Is it really Emma's backpack?" Sarah asked quietly. "We can't be certain yet," Torres replied, "but the evidence is consistent with what we know about her belongings." Sarah nodded, her eyes focused on the carved tree. "That's Mr. Peanuts," she said, pointing to the elephant drawing. "Emma drew elephants like that all the time. She wasn't very good at art, but she always drew them with that same round body and those stick legs." The confirmation sent a chill through Torres. The carving was definitely Emma's work, which meant she had been in this location at some point after her disappearance. The word "help" carved above the elephant suggested that she had been alive when she created it, at least temporarily. Dr. Vasquez's excavation was revealing more pieces of the backpack, along with other items that had been buried with it. She uncovered a small notebook, its pages warped and damaged by moisture but still partially legible. The handwriting inside was a child's, with carefully formed letters that spelled out Emma's name and address on the first page. "We're going to need to expand the search area," Dr. Vasquez told Torres. "This appears to be a primary deposition site, but there may be other areas of interest nearby." The team began a systematic search of the surrounding forest, using metal detectors and probes to examine the ground for additional evidence. The work was slow and methodical, made more difficult by the frozen ground and the thick layer of snow that had accumulated over the winter months. About 50 yards from the carved tree, one of the officers called out. He had been following what appeared to be an old deer trail when his metal detector began signaling. Careful excavation revealed a small metal lunchbox, the kind that children carried to school in the early 2000s. The lunchbox was rusted and damaged, but when Dr. Vasquez opened it, they found items that made Sarah Richardson gasp audibly. Inside the lunchbox were Emma's school supplies, pencils with her name printed on them, a small calculator, and gel pens in bright colors. There was also a photograph, protected by a plastic sleeve, showing Emma and Sarah at a birthday party just weeks before the disappearance. The photo was water-damaged but still recognizable, and Sarah confirmed that it was one Emma had insisted on taking to school for show and tell. "She was here," Sarah whispered, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. "She was really here." But the most significant discovery came when the team expanded their search to include a small ravine about 100 yards from the main site. Officer Chen, a newer member of the force who had joined the department 5 years after Emma's disappearance, was using a probe to check beneath a fallen log when he encountered something that wasn't natural forest debris. "Detective Torres," he called out, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "I think you need to see this." Torres made his way through the snow to where Chen was working. Beneath the fallen log, partially concealed by years of accumulated leaves and debris, was what appeared to be the entrance to a small structure. As they carefully cleared away the natural camouflage, they revealed a wooden door, weathered and partially rotted, but still intact. "It's some kind of shelter, Dr. So," Vasquez observed, examining the construction. "Crude but effective. Someone put considerable effort into concealing this." The structure appeared to be a small cabin or hunting shelter, built into the natural depression of the ravine and camouflaged to blend with the surrounding forest. It was the kind of construction that could have existed for decades without being discovered by casual hikers or hunters, especially if the builder had been careful about concealment. Torres radioed for additional backup before approaching the door. The implications of finding a hidden shelter so close to where Emma's belongings had been buried were too significant to approach carelessly. This could be the location where Emma had been held, the place where her story had continued after her disappearance from Maple Street. When the backup arrived, Torres and 2 other officers carefully approached the shelter. The door was secured with a simple latch, rusted but still functional. Torres used a flashlight to peer through a crack in the door before opening it, checking for any signs of immediate danger or structural instability. What they found inside the shelter was a time capsule of horror and hope that had been sealed away for 12 years. The space was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a low ceiling that would have required an adult to stoop. The walls were lined with rough-cut lumber, and the floor was dirt covered with old blankets and what appeared to be sleeping materials. But it was the walls that told the most heartbreaking story. Every available surface had been covered with drawings, carved words, and scratched messages. The artwork was clearly a child's work: stick figures, animals, flowers, and houses drawn with whatever implements had been available. Among the drawings were desperate messages: "I want to go home. Mum, where are you? And please find me." In one corner of the shelter, they found more of Emma's belongings: her light-up sneakers, now dark and silent, a sweater Sarah recognized as one she had bought for Emma's birthday, and most poignantly, a small stuffed elephant that could only be Mr. Peanuts, weathered and dirty but still recognizable. Doctor. Vasquez documented every detail of the shelter's interior, photographing the drawings and messages from multiple angles. The evidence suggested that Emma had been held in this location for an extended period, possibly weeks or even months. The quantity and variety of the artwork indicated that she had been trying to maintain her sanity and hope through creative expression. "Look at this," Officer Martinez said, pointing to a series of marks carved into one of the wooden wall supports. They appeared to be tally marks, grouped in sets of 5, the way someone might count days or weeks. Torres counted them carefully. There were 43 marks, suggesting that Emma had been in this shelter for more than 6 weeks. The discovery of the shelter raised immediate questions about Emma's fate. If she had been held here for weeks, what had ultimately happened to her? The shelter showed no signs of violence or struggle in its final state, but it also showed no signs of recent occupancy. The last entries in Emma's wall diary appeared to be hopeful rather than desperate, including a drawing of herself and her mother with the words "Going home soon" scratched beneath it. Sarah Richardson stood at the entrance to the shelter, staring at the evidence of her daughter's captivity, with a mixture of heartbreak and relief. For 12 years, she had wondered whether Emma had suffered, whether she had been afraid, whether she had known that people were looking for her. The artwork and messages on the walls provided answers to some of those questions, but raised others that might be even more difficult to bear. "She never gave up hope," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible above the wind through the trees. "Look at all these drawings of home, of us together. She believed someone would find her." Torres studied the shelter with the analytical mind of an investigator, but also with the emotional weight of someone who had carried this case for 12 years. The evidence suggested that Emma had been abducted and held in this location, but it didn't explain who had taken her, why, or what had ultimately happened to her. The discovery of the shelter was a breakthrough, but it was also the beginning of a new phase of investigation that might prove even more complex than the original search. As the team prepared to process the scene and transport the evidence back to the lab, Torres found himself thinking about Ranger, the stray dog who had made this discovery possible. How had the animal known about this location? What connection did he have to Emma's story? The dog's role in uncovering the truth was as mysterious as any other aspect of the case. But for the first time in 12 years, Torres felt that they were finally on the right path. The evidence they had uncovered would lead to new investigations, new questions, and hopefully new answers. Emma Richardson's story was far from over, and the next chapter was about to begin in ways that no one could have anticipated. The forensic analysis of Emma's shelter and belongings took 3 weeks to complete, but the investigation had already begun to take unexpected turns. Dr. Vasquez's team had processed every surface of the small cabin, collecting fingerprints, DNA evidence, and trace materials that might identify Emma's captor. While they waited for lab results, Detective Torres had begun following a new lead that had emerged from the most unlikely source, the dog named Ranger. The veterinarian who had examined Ranger during his stay at the animal shelter had noted something that seemed insignificant at the time, but had gained new relevance in light of recent discoveries. The dog showed signs of long-term care and training, suggesting he had been someone's pet for several years. More significantly, he had been neutered and vaccinated with techniques and medications that were consistent with veterinary practices from the early 2000s. "This dog is older than we initially thought," Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian, told Torres during a follow-up interview. "Based on his dental condition and the type of surgical scarring, I'd estimate he's closer to 12 or 13 years old, not 4 or 5 as we originally assessed." The age estimate was significant because it suggested that Ranger might have been a puppy or young dog around the time of Emma's disappearance. Torres began to consider the possibility that the dog had some direct connection to the original crime, that he might have belonged to either the perpetrator or been present at the scene during Emma's captivity. Working with animal control records and veterinary clinics in the surrounding counties, Torres began searching for documentation of a dog matching Ranger's description who might have been registered or treated in the years around 2003. The search was complicated by the fact that many rural dog owners in the early 2000s didn't maintain detailed veterinary records, and animal registration was less comprehensive than it would become in later years. But persistence paid off when Torres contacted Dr. William Hartley, a retired veterinarian who had operated a practice on the outskirts of Cedar Falls until 2010. Dr. Hartley maintained meticulous records of all the animals he had treated, and he remembered treating a young mixed-breed dog that matched Ranger's description in 2004. "I remember him because of the circumstances," Dr. Hartley told Torres during a phone interview. "The owner was an older man, very reclusive, brought the dog in for vaccinations and neutering, paid in cash, didn't want to provide much personal information. The dog had been injured somehow, had some healing wounds that looked like he'd been in a fight or accident." Dr. Hartley's records identified the dog's owner as Robert Kellerman, a man who had lived alone in a cabin about 5 miles from where Emma's shelter had been discovered. Kellerman had been known locally as a hermit who occasionally worked odd jobs, but mostly kept to himself. The address in the veterinary records led Torres to a property deed search that revealed Kellerman had owned 40 acres of heavily forested land that included the area where Emma's shelter had been found. The implications were staggering. Robert Kellerman had owned the land where Emma had been held captive, and he had owned a dog that matched Ranger's description during the same time period. Torres immediately began searching for current information about Kellerman, hoping to locate him for questioning. What he found was both illuminating and frustrating. Robert Kellerman had died in 2011, 4 years after Emma's disappearance, succumbing to complications from diabetes in a county hospital 2 states away. He had been living in a nursing home for the final 2 years of his life, after suffering a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to care for himself. But Torres's investigation into Kellerman's background revealed a troubling pattern. The man had been arrested twice in the 1990s on charges related to child endangerment, though both cases had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or procedural issues. He had worked as a maintenance worker for the school district in the early 2000s, which would have given him access to information about local children and their routines. The nursing home where Kellerman had spent his final years provided additional pieces to the puzzle. According to staff members who remembered him, Kellerman had been obsessed with a dog he claimed to have lost, frequently asking visitors if they had seen a brown and black mixed breed that he insisted was still looking for him. The staff had assumed he was suffering from dementia-related confusion, but Torres now understood that Kellerman had been talking about Ranger. He used to say the dog would find his way home eventually, recalled Maria Santos, a nurse who had cared for Kellerman. He seemed to think the dog was protecting something important, that he had work to do. We thought it was just confused memories from his illness. The timeline was beginning to make sense. Kellerman had abducted Emma in 2003 and held her in the hidden shelter on his property. For reasons that might never be fully understood, Emma had either escaped or been released after approximately 6 weeks of captivity. Kellerman's dog, Ranger, had somehow remained connected to the location, possibly continuing to visit the site for years after the events. But the most important question remained unanswered. What had happened to Emma after she left the shelter? The evidence suggested she had been alive when she created the final drawings, including the hopeful message about going home soon. If she had been released or escaped, why had she never returned to her family? Torres's investigation into Kellerman's background revealed that the man had suffered his incapacitating stroke in late 2003, just a few months after Emma's disappearance. Medical records showed that he had been found unconscious in his cabin by a neighbor who had noticed his absence from his usual activities. The stroke had left him unable to speak clearly or care for himself, which would have made it impossible for him to continue holding Emma captive. The neighbor who had found Kellerman, an elderly farmer named Eugene Walsh, was still alive and living in the same area. When Torres interviewed him, Walsh recalled the incident clearly and provided information that added new dimensions to the mystery. Bob was acting strange in the weeks before his stroke, Walsh told Torres. He seemed worried about something, kept talking about having to make things right. I saw him walking in the woods a lot that fall, like he was looking for something or trying to remember where he'd put something important. Walsh also remembered that Kellerman's dog had disappeared around the same time as his stroke, though it had returned periodically over the years, always seeming agitated and restless. That dog never seemed right after Bob got sick, Walsh recalled, like he was carrying some kind of burden. The pieces of Emma's story were coming together, but they painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and incomplete. She had been held captive for weeks, had maintained her hope and spirit through art and expression, and had apparently been alive when Kellerman suffered his stroke. But what had happened to an 8-year-old girl who found herself suddenly free but alone in the forest, possibly injured or traumatized, with no clear way to find her way home? Torres began to consider the possibility that Emma had died of exposure or injury after leaving the shelter, that her body might still be somewhere in the vast forest that surrounded Kellerman's property. The thought was devastating, but it would explain why she had never returned home despite apparently being free to do so. But Ranger's behavior suggested otherwise. The dog's persistence in seeking help, his apparent knowledge of the shelter's location, and his focused attention on Emma's missing person poster suggested that his story with Emma might not have ended with her death. Dogs, Torres knew, formed powerful emotional bonds with humans, especially children, and Ranger's behavior suggested the kind of loyalty and protection that extended beyond death. As the investigation continued, Torres found himself spending more time with Ranger, studying the dog's behavior for clues about Emma's fate. The animal had been returned to the shelter after his role in the discovery, but Torres had arranged to visit him regularly, hoping to understand what other secrets he might be protecting. It was during one of these visits that Ranger exhibited behavior that gave Torres a new direction for his investigation. When shown photographs of Emma at different ages, including computer-generated images of what she might look like as a teenager, Ranger showed no reaction to her childhood photos, but became agitated when shown the age progression images, whining and pacing as if he recognized something in the older face that the others couldn't see. The implication was almost too incredible to consider. Could Emma Richardson still be alive? Could Ranger's knowledge of her location extend beyond the historical events of 2003 to something more current, more immediate? The possibility opened up investigative directions that Torres had never considered, and would require him to rethink everything he thought he knew about Emma's disappearance. As winter began to give way to spring in Cedar Falls, the investigation was entering a new phase that would challenge assumptions and reveal truths that had been hidden for more than a decade. The discovery of the shelter had answered some questions about Emma's fate, but it had raised others that would prove even more complex and emotionally challenging to pursue. Spring arrived in Cedar Falls, with the gentle persistence of hope returning to a landscape that had been frozen for too long. As the snow melted and revealed the forest floor, Detective Torres found himself returning to Kellerman's property regularly, walking the same paths that Emma might have taken if she had indeed escaped from her captor 12 years earlier. Each visit brought new questions about how an 8-year-old girl might have survived alone in the wilderness, and whether survival was even possible under such circumstances. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: social media. Officer Martinez had been monitoring online missing children databases and had created alerts for any mentions of Emma's name or similar disappearances. 3 weeks after the discovery of the shelter, she received a notification about a forum post from someone claiming to have information about a girl who lived in the woods near Cedar Falls. The post had been made anonymously on a regional hiking forum, buried among discussions of trail conditions and wildlife sightings. The author claimed to have been leaving food and supplies for a wild girl who appeared occasionally near a remote cabin about 15 miles from Kellerman's property. The post was dated just 2 weeks earlier, and the details were specific enough to warrant investigation. "I've been seeing her for about 3 years now," the forum post read. "She's young, maybe late teens, very shy and skittish, appears to be living rough, possibly homeless. I've been leaving canned goods and blankets at an old hunting cabin. She takes them, but I've never been able to approach her directly. Thought someone should know in case she needs help." Torres contacted the forum administrator and was able to trace the post to an IP address registered to David Mitchell, a wildlife photographer who lived in a remote area about 20 miles from Cedar Falls. When Torres called Mitchell, the man was initially reluctant to provide information, concerned about getting involved in police business. But when Torres explained about Emma's case and the recent discoveries, Mitchell agreed to meet and share what he knew. Mitchell was a man in his 50s who had moved to the area 5 years earlier, seeking solitude for his photography work. He had discovered the abandoned hunting cabin during one of his expeditions and had begun using it as a base camp for his longer trips into the wilderness. It was during these visits that he had first noticed signs of human habitation: a sleeping area that appeared to be regularly used, evidence of food consumption, and small modifications to the cabin that suggested long-term occupancy. "I never saw her at first," Mitchell told Torres as they drove toward the cabin location. "Just signs that someone was living there part-time. But then, about 3 years ago, I caught a glimpse of her near the creek. Young woman, very thin, long dark hair. She ran as soon as she saw me, like a deer startled by hunters." Mitchell had begun leaving supplies deliberately, motivated by concern for whoever was living in such harsh conditions. Over time, he had developed a routine. He would visit the cabin every few weeks, leave food, blankets, and basic medical supplies, then retreat to allow the mysterious occupant to collect the items safely. "I got a better look at her about 6 months ago," Mitchell continued. "She was drinking from the creek when I arrived earlier than usual. When she saw me, she didn't run immediately. We looked at each other for maybe 10 seconds before she disappeared into the trees. But I could see her clearly. Young woman, early 20s maybe, with scars on her arms and face. She looked like she'd been living rough for a long time." The description sent a chill through Torres. Emma Richardson would be 20 years old if she were still alive. The timeline matched perfectly with Mitchell's observations, and the location was within walking distance of Kellerman's property, assuming someone could have survived the journey as a child. But Torres remained skeptical. The idea that an 8-year-old girl could have survived alone in the Michigan wilderness for 12 years seemed impossible. Children died of exposure in much less challenging circumstances, and even if Emma had somehow found food and shelter, the psychological trauma of such isolation would likely have been devastating. However, as they approached Mitchell's cabin, Torres found himself thinking about Ranger's behavior, about the dog's apparent knowledge of Emma's current condition rather than just her historical presence. If Emma were still alive, it would explain why Ranger had seemed so determined to lead someone to the truth, why he had appeared at the police station at this particular time. The cabin was smaller and more primitive than Kellerman's shelter, but it showed clear signs of recent habitation. There was a sleeping area made from salvaged materials, a rudimentary food storage system, and evidence of someone who had learned to live with minimal resources but maximum ingenuity. Most significantly, there were drawings scratched into the wooden walls, artwork that looked remarkably similar to the style Torres had seen in Emma's prison. "She's definitely been here recently," Mitchell said, examining the scene. "These supplies I left last week are gone, and there are fresh markings on the trees outside that she uses to mark her territory." Torres photographed everything, documenting the living space and the artwork, looking for any evidence that might definitively connect this mysterious occupant to Emma Richardson. Near the sleeping area, he found something that made his heart race, a small weathered photograph that appeared to be the same image they had found in Emma's buried lunchbox, showing her with her mother at a birthday party. The discovery of the photograph was compelling evidence, but Torres knew he needed more than circumstantial proof. He needed to find this mysterious young woman and determine whether she was indeed Emma Richardson. But given her apparent fear of human contact and her survival skills, approaching her would require careful planning and patience. Torres decided to use the same strategy that Mitchell had employed. He would leave items at the cabin that might encourage the occupant to reveal herself. But instead of just food and supplies, he would leave items specifically connected to Emma's childhood. Her favorite book, a replica of Mr. Peanuts, and a photograph of Sarah Richardson, with a note explaining who they were looking for. "If this is Emma," Torres told Mitchell, "she's been living in survival mode for 12 years. The trauma of her original captivity, combined with years of isolation, means she might not trust easily or even remember her original identity clearly. We need to approach this with extreme sensitivity." Mitchell agreed to help with the plan, understanding that his established presence in the area made him less threatening than uniformed police officers. They would maintain surveillance of the cabin, document any activity, and wait for an opportunity to make peaceful contact. As they prepared to implement their strategy, Torres found himself grappling with the emotional implications of their possible discovery. If this mysterious young woman was indeed Emma Richardson, her rescue would be a miracle that defied every assumption about survival and human endurance. But it would also mean that she had spent 12 years believing she was alone in the world, unaware that her mother had never stopped looking for her. The thought of Sarah Richardson's reaction to learning that Emma might be alive was almost overwhelming. For 12 years, Sarah had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing her daughter's fate. The discovery of the shelter had provided some answers, but had also raised the specter of Emma's death. Now, the possibility that Emma had not only survived, but had been living just miles away from her hometown, introduced a new dimension of both hope and heartbreak. Torres contacted Dr. Elena Vasquez to discuss the psychological considerations of approaching a potential long-term trauma survivor. Dr. Vasquez recommended involving a specialist in childhood trauma and wilderness survival, someone who could help them understand how 12 years of isolation might have affected Emma's mental and emotional state. If this young woman is Emma Richardson, Dr. Vasquez warned, she's essentially a feral child at this point. 12 years of survival mode, especially beginning at such a young age, could have profoundly altered her ability to trust, communicate, or even remember her original identity. We need to be prepared for the possibility that reunion with her family might be more complex than we imagine. As Torres prepared for what might be the most important phase of his investigation, he found himself thinking about all the factors that had led to this moment. Ranger's mysterious knowledge and persistence, the chance discovery of the shelter, Mitchell's compassionate decision to help a stranger, and the incredible possibility that Emma Richardson had survived against impossible odds. The next phase of the investigation would require patience, sensitivity, and careful planning. But for the first time in 12 years, Torres felt that they were on the verge of bringing Emma Richardson home, not just solving the mystery of her disappearance, but actually reuniting her with the mother who had never stopped believing she would return. The morning of April 15, 2015, dawned with the kind of gentle warmth that promised spring had finally arrived in Cedar Falls. Detective Torres had been maintaining surveillance of Mitchell's cabin for 3 weeks, documenting signs of the mysterious occupant's presence, but never catching sight of her directly. The supplies they had left, Emma's favorite childhood book, the replica of Mr. Peanuts, and the photograph of Sarah, had been taken, but there had been no direct response or attempt at communication. Torres was beginning to wonder if their approach was too indirect, too cautious, when Mitchell called with news that changed everything. "She's here," Mitchell whispered into his radio. "She's sitting by the creek, and she's holding the stuffed elephant." Torres was 20 minutes away from the cabin location, but he forced himself to drive carefully, knowing that any sudden arrival might frighten away the young woman they had been trying to approach for weeks. As he parked his unmarked vehicle at a distance from the cabin and approached on foot, he could see Mitchell's position behind a cluster of trees, and beyond him, near the creek, a slight figure sitting on a fallen log. Even from a distance, Torres could see that the young woman matched Mitchell's previous descriptions. Thin, with long dark hair, wearing a mixture of salvaged clothing and outdoor gear. She was holding the stuffed elephant close to her chest, rocking slightly in a motion that suggested both comfort and distress. Her posture was alert, as if she were ready to flee at the first sign of danger, but she remained focused on the toy in her arms. Torres signaled to Mitchell to remain in position, then began a slow, careful approach toward the creek. He moved deliberately, making enough noise to announce his presence without seeming threatening. When he was about 30 feet away, the young woman looked up and saw him. For a moment that seemed to last forever, they stared at each other across the space that separated them. The face that looked back at Torres was unmistakably Emma Richardson's, aged by 12 years and marked by hardship, but still recognizable from the missing child posters that had defined his career. Her brown eyes held a wariness that spoke of years spent surviving alone, but there was also something else, a flicker of recognition, a spark of memory that suggested the little girl who had disappeared was still present beneath the survival skills and defensive instincts. "Emma?" Torres said quietly, his voice carrying across the clearing. "My name is Detective Torres. I've been looking for you for a very long time." Emma didn't run, but she didn't approach either. She clutched Mr. Peanuts tighter and continued to study Torres with eyes that seemed to be calculating risks and possibilities. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. "You know my name," she said. It wasn't a question, but a statement that carried 12 years of isolation and uncertainty. "Yes," Torres replied, fighting back tears at hearing Emma's voice for the first time since she was 8 years old. "Your mother has been looking for you. She never stopped believing you would come home." The mention of her mother caused a visible reaction. Emma's composure cracked slightly, and Torres could see the 8-year-old child that still existed beneath the young woman's survival-hardened exterior. She began to rock more intensely, and tears started to flow down her cheeks. "My mum," she whispered. Is she still there?" "She's still there," Torres assured her. "She's been waiting for you every day since you disappeared. Would you like to see her?" The reunion that followed was both heartbreaking and miraculous. Sarah Richardson arrived at the Forest cabin accompanied by Dr. Elena Vasquez and a trauma specialist, prepared for the possibility that her daughter might not remember her, or might be too damaged by her experiences to accept help. But when Emma saw her mother approaching through the trees, something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The 20-year-old woman who had survived 12 years in the wilderness suddenly became the 8-year-old girl who had been torn from her family. She ran to Sarah with a desperation that spoke of years of believing she would never see her mother again, and Sarah caught her daughter in an embrace that seemed to bridge the impossible gap of time and trauma. "I drew you pictures," Emma sobbed against her mother's shoulder. "I drew you pictures every day." "I wanted to come home, but I didn't know how. I got lost, and then I was afraid you wouldn't want me back because I stayed away so long." The story that emerged over the following weeks, told in fragments during counseling sessions and quiet conversations, revealed an ordeal that defied comprehension. Emma had indeed escaped from Kellerman's shelter when her captor suffered his stroke, but as an 8-year-old child with no survival skills, she had become lost in the vast forest that surrounded his property. She had survived those first critical weeks by finding shelter in abandoned buildings, eating whatever food she could find or catch, and learning through trial and error the skills that would sustain her for over a decade. The trauma of her captivity, combined with the terror of being lost and alone, had created a psychological state in which returning to civilization seemed more dangerous than remaining hidden. "I kept thinking someone would find me," Emma explained during one of her therapy sessions. "But as time went on, I started believing that maybe my family thought I was dead, that they had moved on without me. I was afraid that if I tried to go back, I would just be disappointing them all over again." The role that Ranger had played in Emma's survival became clearer as her story unfolded. The dog had found her during her first winter in the forest, when she was near death from exposure and malnutrition. Kellerman's former pet had somehow recognized Emma's connection to his deceased owner, and had appointed himself as her guardian and companion. For 12 years, Ranger had helped Emma survive by leading her to food sources, warning her of dangers, and providing the companionship that kept her from complete psychological isolation. When age and instinct finally told him that Emma needed more help than he could provide, he had made his way to the police station to seek human assistance in the only way he knew how. "He was my best friend," Emma said, tears flowing as she was reunited with Ranger at the animal shelter. "He saved my life so many times. I think he knew I was ready to come home before I did." The process of reintegrating Emma into society was complex and ongoing. 12 years of survival living had created behavioral patterns and coping mechanisms that would take time to modify. She had developed an acute sensitivity to her environment, an ability to find food and shelter in the wilderness, and a deep mistrust of most human contact. But she had also maintained her essential identity, her memories of her family, and her artistic abilities that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her isolation. The artwork Emma had created during her years in the forest told the story of a child who had grown into a young woman while never losing hope of reunion with her family. She had documented her experiences in drawings scratched into trees, carved into stones, and traced in the dirt of her various shelters. The images showed her progression from a frightened child to a capable survivor, but they also showed her consistent longing for home and family. Sarah Richardson faced her own challenges in adapting to Emma's return. The daughter who came home to her was not the 8-year-old who had disappeared, but a 20-year-old woman who had experienced traumas and developed independence that most people never encounter. The reunion was joyful, but it was also the beginning of a new relationship that would require patience, understanding, and professional support. "She's different," Sarah acknowledged during a television interview 6 months after Emma's return. "She's been through things that I can't fully understand, and she's learned to take care of herself in ways that amaze me. But she's still my Emma. She still draws elephants the same way, she still loves the same foods, and she still calls me Mama when she thinks no one is listening." The story of Emma Richardson's disappearance and miraculous return became a sensation that captured national attention. But for the family, the media coverage was secondary to the quiet work of rebuilding their relationship. Emma enrolled in a specialized program that would help her earn her high school equivalency and eventually pursue higher education. She also began working with search and rescue organizations, using her survival skills to help find other missing persons. Detective Torres, now retired, often reflected on the case that had defined his career and taught him that sometimes the most incredible solutions were also the most true. Emma's story had challenged every assumption about survival, about hope, and about the power of love to transcend impossible circumstances. On a quiet evening in October 2015, exactly 12 years after Emma's disappearance, 3 generations of the Richardson family gathered in Sarah's backyard for a barbecue. Emma, now more comfortable with social situations but still preferring the outdoors to enclosed spaces, sat on the grass with Ranger beside her, sketching in a notebook while her younger cousins played nearby. The drawing she was working on showed a small house with smoke rising from the chimney, a woman standing in the doorway with her arms outstretched, and a girl walking up the path toward home. At the bottom of the page, in the careful handwriting she had practiced during her years alone, Emma had written, "The journey is finally over." As the sun set over Cedar Falls, casting golden light across the gathering, Sarah Richardson watched her daughter and marveled at the resilience of the human spirit. Emma had been lost for 12 years, but she had never truly been gone. She had carried her family's love with her through every hardship, every lonely night, every moment when survival seemed impossible. And in the end, that love had been enough to bring her home. For Detective Torres, for Sarah Richardson, for Emma herself, and for everyone who had been touched by her story, October 15th would never again be remembered as the day Emma disappeared. Instead, it had become the anniversary of the day a family learned that some journeys, no matter how long or difficult, always lead back to love. The little girl who had vanished on her way to school in 2003 had returned as a young woman who understood the value of every sunrise, every meal shared with family, and every moment of safety and love. Her story became a testament to the power of hope, the loyalty of an unlikely guardian, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us to the people who matter most. In Cedar Falls, Michigan, Emma Richardson was finally home.